Welcome back to Crux Stationalis. Today we explore the Roman station church for the Wednesday of the second week of Lent, the Basilica di Santa Cecilia a Trastevere. Doubts exist as to the veracity of stories around the life of Saint Cecilia, perhaps magnified by Cardinal Paolo Emilio Sfondrati, the nephew of Gregory XIV, who had excavations carried out in the hope of finding the remains of Christian martyrs, transferred to the Basilica of Santa Cecilia in the 9th century from the catacombs of the Via Appia. Sources of the time tell that, when the news of the discovery of the popular early Christian saint spread, that is, of Santa Cecilia, an excited and eager crowd poured into the Trastevere district, hoping to be able to see and venerate her body. They went there as soon as it was possible, even Clement VIII, suffering from illness. The event had an enormous uproar, and Cardinal Sfondrati wanted to commemorate it with the creation of an exceptional sculpture. The work was entrusted to an artist then unknown, Stefano Maderno, who lived from the years 1576 to 1636. But this should not be surprising, because the cardinal had the ability to be the first to exploit still unexpressed talents, whose value he sensed. The sculptor was only 23 years old, and had perhaps come to Rome from those shores of Lake Lugano, which gave birth to several Ticino artists. But it is not clear if he is related to the architect Carlo Maderno, the architect of the facade of St. Peter's Basilica. The young Maderno would have sculpted the saint as she had been found. He placed it in the center of the church, under the high altar, within a black marble case, open on the front and framed by colored marbles, according to a typology of altar then widely repeated. The reduced proportions of the figure, which are 1.3 meters long, seem to emphasize the extreme youth of the girl, who, according to tradition, had been seized by death in a state of absolute purity. The body, found under the altar in a cypress chest enclosed in a marble sepulchre, was truly very small, according to a chronicle written by an eyewitness, and it gave off a strong perfume of roses. Maderno's choice to hide the face of the saint from the viewer appears to be apt, accentuating the aura of mystery that surrounds the saint, along with her veiled purity. A classic form in sculpture, Stefano Maderno interposed a breath of new vitality. It is as if the moment of transition to the new Baroque style was sensed, which would soon explode with Bernini. The position of the fingers, which indicate 3 with the right hand and 1 with the left, also assumes a symbolic meaning. The Trinity is 3 persons in one God. Not only does it signify the Trinity, her 3 fingers are the blows inflicted by her executioners to decapitate her and the days of agony before she died. In its extreme essentiality and with its silent language, the work immediately imposed itself as a new iconographic model, very different from the one with musical instruments, as patroness of musicians, or from the older one which portrayed her with the crown of martyrdom in hand. Among others, Domenichino was inspired by it in the important series of frescoes on the life of the saint in the church of San Luigi dei Francesi, as was Nicolas Poussin for the canvas Santa Francesco Romana announces the end of the plague in Rome, where the figure of the dead woman at the bottom is reminiscent of Maderno's statue. Immediately after the creation of the sculpture, Francesco Vanni painted the saint in the same position, depicted with 2 pious women in a semicircular canvas. The painting was for the crypt of the Basilica of Santa Cecilia and was subsequently housed in the Benedictine convent which sits next door to the basilica. The statue also aroused the admiration of an interesting, though not very edifying personage, such as the Marquis Donatien Alphonse François de Sade, who arrived in Rome on the occasion of the 1775 Jubilee. During his 2-month stay, he visited churches and palaces, noting his impressions. Above all, the emotion felt in front of the images of martyrs caught in suffering. The work of art that struck him the most was Maderno's Santa Cecilia, which he described as follows: "It is a beautiful flower harvested almost in its bud. Cecilia was married very young, and early in the marriage she was martyred in the bath. The signs of the wounds are clearly seen on the beautiful neck, all uncovered. The same shirt she wore in the bath is the one that covers her. The fineness of the folds it forms and the wisdom with which it lets us glimpse the contours are truly sublime. It is a corpse thrown away, but still breathes all the delicacy and vitality of a girl of 17 or 18, as interesting as she is pretty. In this divine work, there is a truth of such force that one cannot see it without being moved. From his words, it is clear that he knew the little information about Santa Cecilia, which was transmitted by the Passio of Saint Cecilia of the 5th to 6th century, and then taken up again in the Legenda Aurea from the 13th century by Jacopo da Varazze. Cecilia would have been martyred in the 3rd century AD, perhaps in the year 230, in her house in Trastevere, in the very place where her church has been erected. The titulus of Saint Cecilia is attested from the 5th century. Her feast day was set for November 22nd, the day of her martyrdom, her dies natalis. Cecilia, probably belonging to a branch of the Cecilii family, had been raised in the Christian faith and always bore the image of Christ upon her chest and the hair shirt of penance under her clothes. Having been promised in marriage to the young Valerian, who was a pagan, and not being able to oppose the marriage, she married him. But on the same day of the wedding, she revealed to him that she was a Christian and wanted to remain pure in her soul and body. Since an angel guarded her virginity, the young man asked to be able to see the angel. She replied that he would see the angel if he becomes a Christian, but first he would need to go 3 miles down the Via Appia to encounter Pope Saint Urban, Pope from the years 222 to 230, and be baptized by him. Valeriano followed Cecilia's instructions, and once he arrived back at home, the angel appeared and placed 2 wreaths of flowers on the newlyweds. The young man was so struck by this celestial apparition that he also desired his brother Terbizio to be converted. The 2 brothers were soon condemned to martyrdom because they secretly buried martyred Christians. Maximus, who was to accompany Valeriano and Terbizio to a column of Jupiter that they might make pagan offerings, was converted by Saint Cecilia. Thus Valeriano, Tiburcio, and Maximus were martyred. After their death, Cecilia was summoned by the judge, and with her words she would convert hundreds of onlookers. Cecilia was then sentenced to death. In the 3 days leading up to her execution, she reportedly donated her home to the church. At the stroke of the 4th day, the executioners tried to kill the young woman in the bath of her house, but she did not die, and she was therefore taken away. 3 blows of the sword were inflicted upon her, but they were unable to behead the saint. She survived 3 days before expiring, bearing testimony to God and converting more souls. Pope Urban buried her in the catacombs of San Callisto. Valeriano, Terbizio, and Massimo, on the other hand, were buried in the cemetery of Praetextatus, and their remains, as well as those of Popes Urban and Lucius, were transferred to the Basilica of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere by Pope Paschal I, who reigned from the years 817 to 824, in order to bring them closer to those of Cecilia, who appeared to the pontiff in a dream, revealing to him where her body was, which he found miraculously intact and incorrupt in the catacombs of Callisto in the year 821, according to what is attested by the Liber Pontificalis. The splendid mosaic in the apse, dated to the year 821, dates back to Paschal I, the rebuilder of the Trastevere church, whose scenographic system is taken from that of the apse of Santi Cosma e Damiano from the 6th century, and reproposed also in the Basilica of Santa Prassede, whose relics were also transferred by the pontiff himself to the church on the Esquiline, which he rebuilt. We recall that the mosaic of Santa Maria in Dominica, the Roman station church for the 2nd Sunday of Lent, also dates back to the same pope, showing the pope kneeling at the feet of the Madonna. The mosaic of Santa Cecilia depicts the theophany of Christ, that is, the manifestation of his divinity, in the episode of the last coming of the Messiah, who appears as he descends among the clouds to earth. There are 7 characters depicted, whose frontal posture appears closer to Byzantine art than to Roman art. In the central position is Christ, holding in his left hand the parchment of the new law, which he is to pass on to St. Peter. To the right of Christ are St. Paul and St. Cecilia, who puts her arm around Paschal's shoulder, depicted with the square nimbus of the living and the model of the church in his hand. To the side of St. Peter, we find St. Valeriano and St. Agatha. Next to the palms, we find the symbol of the phoenix, a symbol of the resurrection. And below, we find the sheep, symbols of the apostles, which converge towards the central mystical lamb, starting from Bethlehem and Jerusalem, the places of the incarnation and the death of Jesus. In the eyes of Paschal I, the saint must have appeared as a virgin martyr of an aristocratic family, and for this reason her clothes appear sumptuous, just as is specified in her Passio, the description of her martyrdom, where it mentions the hair shirt which she wore underneath her woven gold garments. We are still far from her later iconography, which sees her as the patroness of musicians. The only connection with music documented starting from the late Middle Ages could be due to the incorrect interpretation of the following antiphon. The text of this chant in Latin is Cantantibus organis Cecilia Virgo in corde suo soli Domino decantabant dicens. Fiat Domine cor meum et corpus meum immaculatum ut non confundad. While the organs were playing, the Virgin Cecilia sang in her heart only for the Lord, saying, Lord, may my heart and my body be immaculate, so that I will not be confounded. These verses were traditionally referred to Cecilia's wedding feast. While the musical instruments played, Cecilia sang to God within. From here, we moved on to an even more distorted interpretation. Cecilia sang with the accompaniment of the organ, and this is why, starting from the 15th century, the saint began to be depicted with a small portable organ next to her. However, the oldest codices do not report this version of the antiphon, nor the one that would begin with canentibus, a synonym of cantantibus, but rather it states candentibus organis, Cecilia Virgo. The organs, therefore, would not be musical instruments at all, but the instruments of torture, and the antiphon would describe Cecilia, who, among the incandescent instruments of torture, sang to God in her heart. The antiphon would therefore refer to her martyrdom, and not to the wedding banquet. However, it is precisely as a player of the organ or singer that her figure has a great iconographic success, witnessed by countless artists, and also in the Church of Trastevere, the classic organ appears in the Coronation of Santa Cecilia, the fresco by Sebastiano Conca, made in 1727, in the ceiling of the central nave. This fresco was commissioned by Cardinal Francesco Acquaviva, who was responsible for the 18th century reconstruction of the church, and whose coat of arms stands out in the vault above the ciborium. The ciborium, or baldacchino, is one of the must-see masterpieces of the church. It dates back to the year 1293 and is signed by Arnolfo di Cambio, the Tuscan artist who blends the classical tradition with the Gothic style. The tabernacle is supported by 4 black marble columns with Corinthian capitals, on which rest 4 cubes with decorations by cosmatesque masters. The slightly pointed archers are tri-lobed. The spandrels depict prophets, evangelists, and 2 wise virgins. And on the outer corners of the structure, we find Santa Cecilia, Saint Valeriano, Pope Saint Urban, and Saint Turbizio. A complicated structure, veiled in as much mystery as the life of the saint herself. The Basilica of Santa Cecilia and the life of the saint move us to respond to the difficulties and tortures of life, and I also add the joys of life, with one response: singing in our heart for the Lord alone to hear. This alone happens when we foster a life of contemplation, when we set time apart from distractions and from our cares, and we turn to the Lord and meditate on His goodness, His mystery. This alone is what increases charity in the world. This alone is what changes the world.